good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the final 5 St Andrews Hill Autumn Seminar. And we're delighted to be ringing out the season with our Professional Regulatory Team seminar. My name is Alecsandra Manning-Rees, and I'm one of the Professional Regulatory Team here at 5 St Andrews Hill. I have the delightful role this evening of introducing you to our speakers and in true new normal style to deal with the slides. And in typical Zoom style, if I can ask all parties to mute their microphones, if not already done. First, by way of introduction, Wendy Hewitt is head of the Professional Discipline and Regulatory Team at 5 St Andrews Hill. Wendy's main practice is in advising and representing individuals facing all stages of regulatory and disciplinary proceedings. We're also welcoming Guy Micklewright to the team, joining us from Blake Morgan. Guy is a specialist fitness to practice disciplinary and regulatory barrister acting for regulators and registrants, and he's ranked as a rising star in the Legal 500. We also have Dennis Hamill joining us from Northern Ireland, a specialist barrister in professional discipline and one of our new members of the team. He also practices regulatory inquests and inquiries. Dennis is a door tenant here at 5 St Andrews Hill and a key member of our professional disciplinary regulatory team. I've already introduced myself. Our topic tonight is Misconduct Proceedings, Universities and Students, What to Do and What to Expect. Increasingly, there are reports in the media of cases of serious and potentially criminal misconduct investigations and proceedings taking place in universities. These cases can have a catastrophic impact on both the accused, the complainants, and reputationally to the university, not to mention the potential impact for any criminal cases that then may subsequently arise. You'll be hearing first of all from the head of the team, Wendy, who will be focusing on sexual misconduct allegations, the history and guidance used in these proceedings, and about how to handle these criminally analogous cases, which are often conducted with reference to Pinsent Mason's guidance for higher education institutions. We'll be discussing the merits of the guidance and the impact it can have on students facing these accusations. Following on from that, the latest addition to our team, Guy Micklewright, is going to talk us through a best practice guide to conducting investigations within universities in his presentation on what a good investigation should look like, and why getting it right at the start is so important. Dennis will then be helping us with the question and answer section of the seminar, and he has conducted a number of hearings where fitness to practice matters are dealt with in a university setting. We will take all of the questions and answers at the end of the session, but please feel free to place your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen throughout the presentation. If we don't have time to get through them all, then please do feel free to email with your questions again, and we will get back to you. That's all from me for now, so I'll hand over to Wendy.
Thank you, Alex. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Alex has set out exactly where we're going. Can I just emphasise, if we don't get through questions or if anybody wants to get in touch at a later stage, please email us. We are necessarily under some time constraint this evening, and so whilst we're taking an overview of the principles we're looking at, it's very much an overview. I think to cover everything that we would like to would probably take days. I'm going to be looking at the 2016 Guidance for Higher Education Institutes and the principles of it. Alex, could we have the front page of that up on the screen, please? Thank you. This is guidance, as I say, drafted in 2016. It's largely been adopted by the Russell Group of Universities. And I'm going to be discussing that in the context of my own experience of representing students before both misconduct and fitness to practice committees. I should stress that the views are all my own and of my experiences. The guidance is intended to guide universities about how to handle alleged student misconduct, which may also constitute a criminal offence, says it on the front. My talk today is going to focus on sexual misconduct because I would say that represents about 95% of my university disciplinary work. And I'm also going to be referring to young men and young women in that, not to exclude any other sorts of situations, but because my caseload to date has been, I think I can hand on heart say 100%, a case of a female student making a complaint or report after that she'd had non-consensual sexual intercourse with a male student or a sexual encounter. If we could turn, Alex, please, to, it's described as page 1, the introduction, but on the PDF, I think it's probably going to be about page 4, please. Thank you. The guidance makes it clear on this page that this is new guidance, guidance which replaces the old ZELIC report guidance, which universities have been using since the early to mid-1990s. I have to say, in my opinion, it doesn't just replace the ZELIC guidance, it completely rips it up and turns it into confetti. In summary, what the ZELIC report advised universities in this type of situation were fourfold. First, that rape and sexual assault should never be investigated via internal disciplinary procedures. I think, in fact, the report uses the words, it would be out of the question, so to do. Secondly, that universities should not make reports to the police without the victim's consent. I think that's probably fairly uncontroversial still. That students could be excluded or suspended pending a prosecution. And finally, that any disciplinary actions had to wait until the outcome of a criminal trial and the verdict had to be taken into account. The task force, when you look at that page, suggests that it's drafted the new guidance as a consequence of changes in the law. It cites on that page, particularly Human Rights Act of 1998, the Equality Act of 2010. Of course, we will want to bear in mind what has also changed for universities since the 1990s, and that's tuition fees. The cynic in me thinks that students have become consumers, and in fact that's terminology used in the guidance. And the reputation of the university generally may now be more important than the fortunes of its individual members. My experience when the guidance was first published, and I think I first came across a case of this nature being dealt with in this way in about 2017, was that universities had by and large redrafted their disciplinary procedures in line with the recommendations of this report. But there was a general feel that didn't really sit too comfortably with this brave new world of recommendations. I remember being in a corridor of a university with a vice-chancellor around about that time. I was saying we would strongly consider a judicial review if they carried on with what I said was effectively a rape trial in all but name. The response I got then was the university would love somebody to JR them. They were in between a rock and a hard place, and they didn't know if they were supposed to be doing it. Since then, the number of allegations of sexual misconduct has rocketed. It's obviously an area hugely in the public eye at the moment. Me Too, everyone's invited groups, and indeed there's an article on the BBC webpage today about rape culture in schools. You'll have noticed, of course, I've used the word rape twice now. It's defined in criminal law under the Sexual Offences Act, but universities don't, in my experience, recognise the word. I am, when I go to represent my students, repeatedly told this isn't about rape or sexual offences. This is a contractual matter to be dealt with by the university as a matter of student discipline. And I have to say that is a stance I still find, no matter how often I'm told that, quite breathtaking. On the second page of the guidance, you actually see that contention. And at page 3, universities are reminded that the contract and the duties under it extend both to the reporting party and the student who is the subject of the allegations. In my experience, it doesn't seem to cut both ways, though. Usually the reporting party is given support, even pretty much every time extending to being given somebody to sit with them in the hearing. I say her again, I'm generalising, but that's my experience. And the student facing the process tends to get a letter telling them about the allegations, and there'll be a hearing, and at the end it says, you can access support from your union or from the wellbeing portal. And from there, they're usually on their own, or looking for a lawyer for the first time in their life if their parents can afford it. So what are the general principles of the guidance? First, On a complaint being made, the university must conduct a risk assessment to decide whether any precautionary measures are required, and that's page 8 of the guidance when you get to that. There can be things like no-go zones, no contact between the reporting student and the accused student, including in lectures or in sports teams. It's a bit like an interim order in healthcare regulation, really, but without an independent panel deciding it. You will see at page 8. Alex, if you could scroll down a little bit, please. Thank you. On the right-hand side, the decision to suspend a student as a precautionary measure should be made at a senior level, and the student should have an opportunity to make representations. I'll link back that to what I say about universities' reputation, wish for risk in a moment, but it's quite easy to see there that there is no sort of independent or impartial assessment when this precautionary exclusion or precautionary measures step is looked at. I'm aware of a case, and I don't know whether Richard Etherington from Richard Nelson LLP is on the call at the moment, but I discussed only a matter of weeks ago a case with Richard where he is representing a student who is the subject of a sexual complaint. There hasn't been any sort of investigation yet, but on a risk assessment, his university has deemed that he is a risk to all women and can therefore not be housed with any. And he's been moved out of his shared residential flat on campus and moved to live alone in some unused disabled accommodation where he is, I suspect, not quite having the student experience he had very much hoped he would have. If reporting goes to the police, then it is stressed that the criminal process must take priority and the university must take no action except that necessary precautionary action as is deemed by that single assessment. But here's the rub of the guidance, because when the reporting student doesn't go to the police, and section 7 of the guidance notes that there's absolutely no legal requirement for the reporting student so to do, nobody can oblige it, then the guidance says that the university should, and you will note the mandatory should, consider whether a breach of discipline has occurred. The internal process, a civil matter, has to be proved on a balance of probabilities. I don't need to tell a group of lawyers what the problems of this guidance are there staring us in the face when we defend. In a few minutes, Guy's going to be talking to you about the investigation process, what an investigation should look like, and sadly, really, they're not generally across the board compliant with what he's going to tell you about. In my experience, there are some universities who hire an independent investigator. There is, for example, a cohort of retired police officers who are called in by some of the universities I go to on a frequent basis. The investigators I've encountered, even when they're former police officers, were never specially trained sexual offences officers during their time in uniform. You only have to stop if you've ever done any criminal work or any sex offence cases. Just stop and think about rape, serious sexual offences, and see how they're investigated in the real world. And when you compare that to what universities are doing, how they're approaching this, you can see straight off how dangerous the investigations can be from the start. A reporting student going to the police would usually be the subject of an achieving best evidence interview by an experienced specialist officer. Evidence gathering includes things like downloading of devices and mobile phones. Evidence is considered by a RASO specialist at CPS to see whether it meets the code for prosecution. Absolutely nothing like that happens in this jurisdiction. There's no sort of fail-safe at all. The university invariably, in my experience, takes the view that to ask a student reporting to hand over their phone is grossly intrusive and would stop other people coming forward. I've indeed only ever had one case where the investigator did not find the case strong enough to recommend sending the allegation to a misconduct tribunal, and in that case, the investigator's decision was overruled anyway. What does a misconduct committee hearing look like in this jurisdiction? I can give you some certainties, not necessarily that many. There are usually between 5 and 7 panel members, sometimes in addition a legal advisor. The majority of the panel are staff drawn from different departments, and then there are usually 1 or sometimes 2 student members, although the student members are usually co-opted from the student union. And in some respects, that again gives a slight perception of bias. And usually a professor presents the case on behalf of the university. Well, so far so good. Thereafter, what you can expect from a hearing is completely and utterly, in my experience, unpredictable. It is not always, but usually, fairly hostile to the student accused of the sexual misconduct. Cross-examination of the reporting student, if allowed at all, usually takes the form of written questions being submitted to the chair, and the chair deciding which will be allowed, and he or she will ask them. During one case that will probably never leave my memory, I submitted very reluctantly my cross-examination, as it would have been if I'd been allowed to stand up and ask questions in the way that I consider myself to be obliged to do. I think the questions ran to about 20 typed pages. The chair deigned to ask about 5 of them before rounding on me to tell me that, and I quote, "We would never have anyone coming forward if they thought we were going to put them through that." Which is strange territory indeed to be in as a barrister, when in any court or tribunal, our professional obligation is to put our lay client's case. And all that time, as I say, the reporting student gets a supporter. And in my experience, the student responding to those allegations has to fight time and time again, either through counsel or themselves, to stop being shut down. The student you represent is told that the panel is expecting to hear from them, that they have to answer the questions, not their barrister. There is huge variation on the extent to which you're allowed to call your student to give evidence in chief, or indeed to make any submissions on their behalf. It's completely unpredictable. The general mood in the room, if I had to describe it, suggests that my job is to defend the indefensible, and not to ensure that a fair process is followed and all relevant, appropriate evidence ventilated. I have to say, and I've said already, these are my views, but I can't count how many of these types of cases I've done. The overwhelming impression I have every single time is that no one on any of these committees I've been before has ever been part of a hearing outside of a university context. There's no real feel for what the law is. Some of the questions are extraordinary, verging on oppressive. Because they don't like the rape word and they don't accept these are rape cases in all but name, there's quite often a refusal to consider the concept of, for example, something quite important really, reasonable belief in consent. The problem of the questions and the problem that you have when you are defending in this position it is the extent to which you make a fuss and how productive or counterproductive it can be. It's obviously more of a problem now in remote hearings. Pre-COVID, nobody could stop a barrister making much of a stink about the questions as we thought necessary. And if a chair declined to ask them, as they usually do, then we would just be taking a very careful note of what was asked next and stacking up the appeal points one by one. Nowadays, the joining instructions for all of the hearings held remotely at universities contain a warning that if any party tries to be disruptive, not my word, will be forcibly ejected from the meeting, Jackie Weaver style. There is, of course, a very fine line between defending someone fearlessly and leaving them alone in a room. On a couple of occasions, I can certainly say I've come uncomfortably close to that line. Some of the questions committees asked have been, in my particular view, genuinely inappropriate. I had one professor suggesting that ungentlemanly conduct in having sex with belief in consent in a car, which the girl regretted the next day, was misconduct and a fitness to practice issue for a medical student. Victoria Rees, you'll know all about that one. Well, of course, if that's right, I can think of a lot of older practitioners who should be taking a cold, hard look at themselves. Another student went through a misconduct panel hearing in which the committee found that he had had sex with a fellow student without her consent, but that he had done so unintentionally and negligently. Again, for practitioners to hear those sorts of determinations doesn't sit happily. In that particular example, and I think it's worth looking at this, that student by the misconduct committee was fined £1,000 in order to undertake community service, which of course doesn't fit in at all with the usual concepts that fitness to practice proceedings are not designed to be punitive in nature. If we could go to page 14, please, Alex, on the guidance. Thank you. And the middle section of sexual misconduct down a bit, please. So these are the kind of sanctions being suggested by Pinsent Masons and the task force in the guidance for sexual misconduct. And you'll see it's a slightly unusual range. Expulsion for the worst sort of behaviour, sexual intercourse without consent. Again, I don't know of any sort of regulator, apart from the BACP, which is a bit fluffy, going down to a written apology being appropriate for sexual misconduct. But you'll see very clearly the sort of things that the task force had in mind. Going back to the hapless student who had had unintentional and negligent sexual intercourse, he paid his fine, starting to do his community service at the point where, because he was a medical student, the Misconduct Committee then reported him to the Fitness to Practice Committee. And that committee, without sight of the Misconduct Committee's findings, latched onto his adoption of the words unintentional and negligent to form the view that he lacked any insight or remorse and promptly expelled him. Again, extraordinarily unfair as a system goes, and that, as those who instruct me know, is currently the subject of an appeal. We all know in the criminal context that the rate of reporting serious sexual offences is low. The rate of prosecutions brought is even lower, and the conviction rate is lower still. But the danger here, in my view, is that universities dealing with these types of allegations as a civil matter of discipline results in a grossly distorted playing field between the reporting student on the one hand and the student accused of misconduct. And it's so frequent that when I receive an investigation report as part of my brief, when the investigator speaks to the reporting student, she is expressing the view, I think in pretty much every case I've seen, that she has a perception that going to the police will be harder and simply reporting it to the university would be an easier way to resolve the complaint. And in fact, those girls are probably right. Investigations lacking robustness, a lack of ability to challenge a reporting student's account by way of cross-examination, dramatically curtailed, and the ability of the accused student to mount any sort of strong defence is certainly heavily curtailed. With reputation at stake, of course, what's the incentive for a university to make brave decisions and to find in the young man's favour? It seems to me that it may well be that the different dynamics and pressures faced by universities in these types of cases are simply irreconcilable. Nobody is suggesting in this that the Me Too type stories don't make for utterly depressing reading. And I've no doubt that the free available of pornography on the internet and the violence that some of that contains has had a really profound effect on the generation who are currently at university from everything I see. But there are often no winners in this. The reporting student in one case in which I defended, a young woman who, again, had chosen not to go to the police, the reasons I've given, later appeared anonymously in a television programme about her experience. She said, even with the university dealing with it, she didn't feel supported. It was invasive, it took too long. And the questions in cross-examination asked by me through the chair on that occasion too were oppressive and objectionable. But for me, there's another end to this particular telescope, because young men at the start of their professional lives who believe themselves to have been in a consensual sexual encounter are often reported weeks or months down the line. The investigation and evidence gathering is, as I said, constrained in so many ways, and being expelled from university at the end of what is often a very hostile hearing indeed, sometimes lasting only half a day, must be bitter indeed. In concluding my comments, I've been asked what needs to change. For you to decide whether this guidance reflects the moving times and whether the Zellick report and findings are out of date is a matter for you. There's a huge range of opinion on the subject, and I'm not suggesting that anybody is right or wrong. But for me, better management of these type of allegations starts with three things. First, standardisation of procedures between universities, because at the moment, each adopts their own based on the guidance. Secondly, I think there needs to be much more experience of what criminal, sexual and disciplinary hearings look like in the real world. And thirdly, I think there needs to be a far greater degree of independence from and impartiality of the university in terms of the composition of any panel. As Alex has said, we will take questions at the end if there's time, But for now, I'm going to thank you for listening to me and hand over to Guy.
Good evening, everyone. I've prepared a slideshow, partly so that, unlike our Prime Minister, I don't lose my place in my notes as I'm going along through my presentation. But I can certainly promise not to make any references to Daddy Pig or Peppa Pig World during the course of this evening. I'm speaking, as Alex has already set out, on investigations in the context of university conduct proceedings, and like Wendy, I'm going to confine the area that I talk about to investigations into student misconduct, which is not academic misconduct. Were I to seek to expand into academic misconduct, that would take us far beyond the time frame which we have available. These procedures are ultimately governed by the Office of the Independent Adjudicator. And the Office of the Independent Adjudicator, or the OIA as it's known, has published a good practice framework, much of which is based around the Pinsent Mason's advice, which you've already seen this evening. There are a number, as you can see in that slide, of fundamental principles that can be adduced from the good practice framework that deals with disciplinary procedures. In particular, that the procedures should be accessible, should be clear, there should be proportionality, timeliness, fairness, independence, confidentiality, and the phrase which commonly appears, improving the student experience. The rules of natural justice should apply, and the procedures should properly identify what amounts to misconduct and what the results of that may be. Also, additionally, and has already been referred to, the presumption is that if a criminal investigation is already underway, then the outcome of that should be awaited before conducting an internal investigation, even though precautionary action may be taken. Could we have the next slide, please, Alex? Thank you. It is, as Wendy's already said, and as featured in the guidance, absolutely right to say that university disciplinary proceedings are founded on a contract law relationship between the students and the university. However, one point of relevance to note is that there is very much a public law flavour to the way in which this contractual relationship functions, partly because of the fact that universities are offering a public service, are a public body, but the result of that is that because of that public law flavour, the standard of fairness that is required in public law decision making applies also to universities, and the authorities for that I've set down there. I'm not going to deal with the precautionary measures that I've set out there and the way in which they're approached, because Wendy's already dealt with those. However, to reflect what Wendy's already said, it's important to realise, I think, in what is doubtless for the university and other higher education institutions a particularly challenging type of conduct to deal with, that there's the potential for significant impact on all parties when a complaint has been made. As has been said, currently there is facility for support for complainants, and certainly there is a general approach of signposting support services for students, but it does fall rather short of that. In many respects, for the student who is the subject matter of an allegation, which amounts to misconduct, and it need not be as serious as the sort of sexual allegations which we've thus far been talking about. There is always the very real potential for that to have a very serious impact on their reputation, on their career prospects, and indeed consequentially, financially. And whilst technically such interests wouldn't amount to an Article 1, Protocol 1 possessory rights in the same way that membership of a profession does, it's perhaps instructive to look at some of the procedural safeguards and expectations that arise within the context of all the sort of fitness to practice investigations that we're familiar with, because one would hope that a fair and robust, albeit supportive investigation, if conducted properly, should be able to best support the complainant, who may be going through a very difficult time indeed, but also similarly come to a fair decision while supporting a student against whom the allegations have been made, who will be going through, no doubt, a stressful time as well. Next slide, please. Starting with the planning of the investigation. An investigator is clearly required, and they should be genuinely independent and also suitably trained. And the scope of what suitably trained is, Wendy's already touched on. They need to understand how best to conduct an investigation. They need to know how to deal with an investigation into what may be very serious and sensitive matters in a suitably sensitive way. And they also need to have the skill set that would be required to investigate a case of that nature in terms of identifying and collating appropriate evidence, as well as understanding and being fully familiar with the university's own rules and policies, which ultimately is what it's going to be alleged if the investigator concludes there's a case to answer that the student has breached. In these sorts of cases, the likely sources of evidence need to be identified, and overwhelmingly they're going to be direct witness evidence, primarily in a sexual case of the complainant. But also, additionally, it's highly likely that there's going to be evidence that could be obtained from mobile devices, looking particularly to SMS, WhatsApp messages, maybe also Facebook messages via the personal messaging, or indeed there may be comments that have been made on open source social media, such as tweets or comments made on Facebook or Instagram or other platforms. The sort of steps that one would expect an investigator to take, many of us would be very familiar with, particularly those of us who are used to investigating fitness to practice matters. Interviews for witnesses need to be planned. Those plans need to ensure that all relevant matters will be covered, particularly if dealing with a complainant in a very serious and sensitive case. The last thing one wants to do is to have multiple unnecessary interviews. Ideally, one would want to deal with it in one interview in order to avoid having to put that individual through more stress than is strictly necessary in order to investigate the complaint properly. Consider whether or not it's appropriate when notifying a witness that they may be a witness to the issues in the case and they would like to be interviewed, to consider whether or not there's documentary evidence that they could provide and to provide it to the investigator in advance, or indeed if there's any documents they need to be asked about, to provide that to the witness in advance of meeting with them. Sometimes investigators may feel that they need the benefit of legal advice or other advice, and investigators should be advised that they should not be shy about seeking such advice. Far better to seek it at an early stage and get the investigation right, rather than seek to deal with problems much later in the process, where they when they may well be much harder to deal with, and also cause distress to the parties involved. Next slide, please. So dealing firstly with witnesses, and then I'll come on and deal with documentary evidence, non-witness based evidence. Generally speaking, it will be sensible to interview, unless there's good reason not to, the complainant first, because they are going to have primary knowledge of the allegation, and from them you're most likely to be able to, as an investigator, identify where other sources of evidence are going to come from. It's important, obviously, ensuring that proper preparation has been done, but it's important to do so promptly. Recollections fade, evidence can be lost, and it's important, as all of us who have both conducted investigations, presented cases, prosecuted criminal cases, and defended them, to ensure that as contemporaneous an account as possible is obtained, particularly in these sorts of cases. A lot of this is happening already in universities, but it is important that it happens in a supportive environment. The issues that are going to be covered are going to be challenging. They may be very distressing to recall, and there may need to be adjustments made as to how that evidence is best facilitated. Of course, any temptation to do anything that might lead to improving the witness's evidence inappropriately needs to be resisted. And the focus very much needs to be on ensuring that that witness and the complainant is facilitated giving an account that is ultimately in their own words, but is the best evidence they can give. Ensure that there is a note keeper present. That person's role is to take as verbatim notes as is possible, and that will ensure that the evidence has been properly captured, whilst ensuring that the investigator is free to think about and ask questions. Ask the witness to sign the notes at the end of the interview, and in most cases it would be appropriate to formulate a formal statement for a witness to consider at a later stage and to sign, or to identify any changes which they feel need to be made. Similarly, don't assume that other witnesses who aren't the complainant or the student won't also need support, be it by way of signposting to student services or similar sources of support, or simply having support in the hearing. Next slide, please. Dealing with the documentary and other evidence. Firstly, ensure that the evidence is properly captured and properly retained. This is essential and basic. Keep a schedule of material that has been obtained during the investigation, and include with that correspondence with witnesses, interview plans and interview notes, not just the primary documents that arise out of the investigation, such as statements and images and videos and so on. Those documents can be, as many of us will know, important to, just as important to an assessment of whether or not there's a case to answer, as indeed the primary evidence that's been obtained. Investigators, of course, have no powers to seize documents. They're not the police, and they're not even regulators, who often have a statutory power to be able to write to members of the public and require them to provide documents or other evidence as part of their investigation. As a result, the investigators are very much working on the goodwill of the witnesses, and Wendy's already identified some of the problems which arise as a result of that. There are perhaps some ways in which information from mobile devices can be secured in a way that is as fair as is possible, at least within the constraints that these sorts of investigations have. I'd suggest that one way of doing that is to actively ask the witnesses in advance of meeting, or alternatively during the course of the investigation, or alternatively during the course of the interview, if it seems that they have relevant material, to provide it themselves and to ensure that it is fulsome and complete. Next slide, please. The fundamental problem with that sort of evidence is that it can become self-serving, or that it can become edited, not necessarily maliciously, but it can become edited sometimes innocently, around what that individual considers either to be the most relevant material, or alternatively, if there is some malice at play, even worse, edited to ensure that material that might undermine the complaint that is being made is removed and not brought to the attention of the investigator. That's why I suggest what goes with any request for evidence is a request, firstly, for which sets out the scope of the evidence that's sought, so there can be no doubt as to the breadth of the evidence that's sought. For example, setting out dates between which WhatsApp conversations or the like are sought for. But secondly, also asking for written confirmation that the entirety of that material has been provided, and if it hasn't been provided, what the reasons are. Additionally, it may be sensible, prior to having those interviews, for open source social media to be looked at that point and screenshots taken to avoid material being removed because of embarrassment or concern, again, that it might undermine a complaint that's being made. Next slide, please. Interviewing the student. Clearly, this is a very important stage in the investigation, as important as interviewing the complainant. And it's very easy for this stage to become oppressive, and it shouldn't be. And certainly the criminal law, these aren't obviously criminal investigations, but certainly the criminal law has spent an awful lot of time and effort ensuring that interviews of suspects don't become oppressive. By oppressive, I don't mean it needs to be directly intimidating, but nevertheless, the circumstances and the way in which the interview takes place, even with the best of intentions, can heighten nervousness and can preclude a student from being able to give their best account. So my suggestions are these. Firstly, provide disclosure to the student in advance. Don't ambush them with questions where they haven't had an opportunity of understanding at least a flavour of what the evidence is going to be against them. I'd suggest a document setting out the allegations and provision of as much of the evidence as is reasonably possible at that time. Consider also, as I previously said, what support and, in the case particularly of a disabled student, what reasonable adjustments might need to be made to ensure that they are able to give their best account. It's also worth bearing in mind that whilst there's been a certain amount of litigation on whether or not there's a right to have legal representation at hearings, any student is entitled at any point during the process to seek legal advice, and they may well want to. And I'd suggest it, in fairness, students should be invited to consider it right at the very outset of the process. not least because lawyers' involvement on behalf of the student can often prove to be a positive thing for the process rather than an antagonistic thing if it's approached in an appropriate and sensible way. Next slide, please. Once the gathering of evidence has been concluded, and I'm looking at the clock, so I'll move through this fairly swiftly. Once the gathering of the evidence has been concluded, then of course a report is going to need to be drafted. What's important about the report is that it needs to be well structured, but it really does need to be fair and easy for the student in question to understand. That requires properly particularised allegations. They don't need to be to the standard that one might expect in a full fitness to practice hearing, but they need to encapsulate properly the allegation that's been made and also which part of the university rules are said to have been breached. There needs to be, if there is a summary of the evidence, which is a good idea in my view, it should be a fair and balanced summary, including matters which undermine the investigation. A lot of these reports will include the view of the investigator as to whether or not there is a case to answer. Different institutions may take a view as to whether or not that's strictly necessary. Ultimately, there will have to be someone who makes that decision, and in reality, the investigator's view is only going to be a view and a recommendation. But where the investigator is somebody genuinely experienced, suitably trained, and has had the opportunity to hear what the parties have had to say, there may well be some value in investigators giving that recommendation. And certainly in investigations for regulators, that's something which lawyers charged with carrying out those investigations commonly do. Next slide, please. Finally, dealing with confidentiality. The investigation itself and its contents are confidential. These aren't public proceedings, and in any event, even if these were criminal proceedings, it would still be confidential at the investigation stage. A lot of investigations are likely to include special category data within the meaning of the GDPR, particularly if one is talking about fitness to practice student investigations and medical students. There's a high likelihood of special category data being involved. That, as many will know, engages extra duties under the GDPR and the Data Protection Act to ensure that data is processed appropriately and that its security is kept. Witnesses and the student, I suggest, should be reminded of the confidential nature of the process. And steps should be taken internally to ensure that the material is handled in a proper way. I think the reality of practice of most universities is that material is provided to individuals in a wholly unredacted format. And we'll all be familiar with the risks that engenders. This, of course, is one of the advantages of students being represented by lawyers, because lawyers are much better able to ensure that data is kept secure. And once a report and accompanying evidence, which will contain lots of sensitive data, is distributed to students and potentially other third parties, then the university has lost control of that information. As a result, I suggest that attention is made to redact material in the way very much that the regulators do during fitness to practice hearings, and to ensure that suitable software is used to facilitate the safe transference of electronic files containing that to those involved. Inevitably, there are going to come times also when subject access requests under the Data Protection Act and FOI requests are going to be made as a way of seeking disclosure, and those can be very time consuming. As a result, I'd suggest that one of the benefits of open disclosure right from the very outset is that those sorts of requests are going to be less common, and it's going to be easier for investigators and institutions to be able to manage the material in an effective way and indeed a fair way. So that, in summary, and it is inevitably a very brief trot through, is where I see to be the key components of a fair investigation in advance of a hearing. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to deal with the question and answer session now. There's a number of questions that have come in during the talks. The first question is, accessing mobile phone data is difficult for the police, but what right of access does a regulator have? Is this not one of the problems for fairness when there has not been a prosecution? Exculpatory material not available, leaving with a he said, she said. Guy, I think you touched on that to a considerable extent during your talk, but is there anything else that you want to add in relation to that?
Yes, well, it's absolutely right to say that the university doesn't have a right to require a student or any other party to provide them with their mobile phone. That doesn't mean that they can't ask for the mobile phone and to have access to it. But as Wendy's already rightly said, most universities would take the view that that would be an inappropriate intrusion in the private life of students. So what I've sought to do, recognising that, is to seek to find a halfway house that can ensure that there's a way in which universities feel that they can justify being able to seek that evidence that's plainly obvious and going to be relevant, but do so in a way that's going to preserve some sort of fairness. Because by asking individuals whether or not they've provided the entirety of what's being sought, and if not, why not, that at least serves as a marker as to whether or not there's been something going on in the background that means it's less than complete. Now, whether or not one would actually be permitted the opportunity to be able to deploy that at a later stage in a hearing to undermine the credibility of a witness who has deliberately kept back information is perhaps a very different matter indeed.
Thanks very much, Guy. There was a second question which came in from Victoria Rees, and that is that some university policies seem to specifically refuse the right of a student to have a representative, specifically a lawyer, at their fitness to practice hearing. Do you have experience of this, and what is your advice on how to deal with this? I think, Wendy, you maybe would be able to deal with that.
I can, Dennis, thank you. Victoria, thanks for that question. The case you need dates from, I think, November of last year, November 2020, and it's called AB against the University of XYZ. It was heard in the Queen's Bench Division. And in that case, the High Court allowed a claim for breach of contract brought by a student against his university and found that the university had acted illegally in refusing the student representation. It applied in that case, as far as I remember it, you caught me slightly on the hop, a very old case called Ex Parte Tarrant, dating back to about the mid-1980s. And there were a number of factors in that which were featured. But that's the one you want in your back pocket, I would suggest. If a university says a lawyer can come, but only to support, the student must speak for, and again, I'm generalizing, but for himself, and must make his own submissions, and you cannot act as an advocate in any way. I would start litigating that by correspondence first and drawing out that case. If you want me to send you a copy of it later, I'm really happy to do that.
If anybody wants the neutral citation for that case, I have it to hand, which is 2020 EWHC 2978.
Thanks
Thanks,
very
Guy.
much, Wendy, and thanks, Guy. There was a further question that had come in from Linda Lee, which I think is probably following on from what you were talking about, Guy, and that is, can you draw an adverse inference if they choose not to disclose? Have you any comment on that, Guy?
I think the reality of that is as I hinted at, whether or not you're going to be permitted to invite an adverse inference to be drawn, to ask questions about that, and indeed whether or not a panel would be prepared to. So I think, in short, the answer is yes. There's nothing precluding that from happening, but I think the unfortunate reality a lot of the time is that no adverse inference would be drawn, and indeed, if there is to be anything adverse drawn out of it, it would perhaps be against the student for seeking to raise that as an issue. But in principle, no, there's no reason why an adverse inference shouldn't be drawn, and I think that that panels should be having close regards to any refusal to provide evidence and examine the reasons why.
Thank you, Guy. Conscious of the time, there's just a couple of quick matters. Perhaps, Wendy, could you address us on the issue of an appeal? There's obviously internal appeal processes within the university, but what are your options once you've exhausted the internal processes?
This is a really interesting point, because the answer is nobody quite knows. You do have to go through the university's internal appeal process. You have to exhaust that before any other options are available to you. There are two schools of thought, and neither is really a perfect fit. The first is that you can go to the OIA, but your redress there would be very, very limited. It takes a long time, and they would simply, if they agreed with the case, remit it back to the university to be redealt with under the same procedures, which doesn't necessarily achieve a lot. The second train of thought, and I stress that I am not a JR expert, but what we've been looking at in a number of cases is whether a decision of a university could be JR'd. Of course, it's preferable to try and get the right result first off at the hearing, but if you don't, that's certainly a possibility to consider as to whether there are any mileage on that. Dennis, I know that you had some similar thoughts in Northern Ireland on those lines. Can you talk us through what your procedure is, please?
Yes, I've done a number of cases here in Northern Ireland, and there is an option that you can go to the Northern Ireland Public Service Ombudsman after you get the final result of a fitness to practice hearing. I haven't had to do it before, but from other cases that I'm aware of involving the Ombudsman, I suspect it would be likely to take a considerable period of time. And it seems to me, and I stress like you that I haven't looked at the matter in detail, but it seemed to me that there might be an option to bring judicial review proceedings. You would likely be faced with an argument that there is an alternative remedy, but you could perhaps defeat that argument on the basis that it's not an effective alternative remedy. So it's certainly something to think about if you get to the stage where you have an adverse fitness to practice final decision from a university. Just one last query that I wanted to that had come in as well, and that is, I think we've touched on this to some extent already, but where you identify issues of procedural fairness, or there are legal points which you want to take in fitness to practice or misconduct proceedings before a university, what's your experience of how the panel deals with that? If I could maybe pass that one over to you, Wendy.
There's another short answer to that. Is every bit as hit and miss as the rest of the entire procedure. You can sometimes find a panel sitting with a legal advisor, and the legal advisor can be quite sensible about it, or can say this is completely irrelevant and just go back to the mantra. This is a contractual relationship between the university and the student, and it's a matter of how we govern that contract by way of discipline. And I think that feeds into everything I was saying about just the vast inexperience outside of this context of pretty much every panel I've been in front of. They don't really take on board legal arguments. They don't really take on board the procedural fairness points, because it's completely alien to them. We find that And this goes back to Victoria's question about AB and the University of XYZ. We find that these are issues that we have to try and really hammer out in correspondence beforehand. And you can break them down a bit, but ultimately it's just as every bit as unpredictable as what you get when you get to the hearing itself. It's very character driven, or very, very personality driven. And so, yeah, you might turn up on a particular day and get a panel who are prepared to listen and who say, yeah, you're right, that doesn't seem fair at all. Or, as a matter of law, that doesn't seem right. But equally, you get a lot of panels who just bang this is discipline, we can do what we like. And that is reflected, as Guy has said, in just the imbalance of power between the two parties, really.
Thanks very much, Wendy, Guy and Dennis, for taking us through all of those points. Unfortunately, that is the end of our topic this evening. We hope that you've enjoyed our seminar and we hope to do more in the future. So do please let us have your feedback. The slides and materials will be emailed to all participants after this event this evening. So thank you very much for joining us and we look forward to seeing you all hopefully in person in the future.